here at the library. I'm just going to start with a bit of housekeeping. So first thing, there's no fire drill planned, so if the fire alarm does go off, just come out, go out the way you came in, and we'll congregate just outside by there. The talk should last around 45 minutes or so. It'll be followed by a Q&A. With the Q&A, if you can try and keep your questions short and snappy, just to give as many people as possible an opportunity to ask a question. So we should be wrapped up in about an hour 15 or so. We're quite loose on the timing, so if we have a good discussion at the end of the talk, we might last a bit longer. If you have to be somewhere and you have to leave, we won't be offended, you can shoot off. The talk is being streamed, so if you've got a phone on you, please put it on silent. And if you want to go to the toilet, there's one at the back. And if you want a bit more privacy, if you leave this room, go to the ramp opposite, there's another toilet inside the main library building. That's it from me. I'm just going to hand over to Belinda, the library manager, who's going to introduce the talk. And I'm going to hand over to Taj.
Hi, as Nathan said, my name is Belinda. I'm the manager here at the Working Class Movement Library. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to all of you for being here, particularly on such a sunny day. Today's lecture is the Frow Lecture, which is our annual celebration of our founders, Edmund and Ruth Frow, and to celebrate their legacy and how their passion for activism and working class movement history laid the foundation for our archive. And today we're still trying to uphold their vision and provide free access to our collection, keep adding to our collection, care for it, and do a series of events and exhibitions like this one. And we really do appreciate your support, because it's only through your support that we can continue to do that, and in particular to provide free access for everybody and make sure that events like this remain free for everybody. So today's Frow Lecture has been given by Taj Ali. We're absolutely delighted to have him here today. The title of the talk is The Making of the British South Asian Working Class, and it draws on his forthcoming publication, which is called Come What May, Here to Stay, A Story of South Asian Resistance. Taj is a historian and journalist, has written for The Guardian, The Independent, The Huffington Post, and is the former editor of Tribune Magazine. And so with that, I'll hand over to Taj, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here today. I guess it's probably worth just talking a bit about how I came to do this research on British South Asian history. I'm a proud British Kashmiri from Luton. My dad grew up in Luton in the 1970s and 80s at a time where there were certain roads that you couldn't walk through as a black or Asian person because you'd get your head kicked in by racist thugs. And so we grew up understanding this history of racism, of violence that our elders faced. And when I was growing up in Luton, I went to a school that was 99% black and Asian. There was only one white person in my entire year group, and even he was Irish. And so, it was a very sort of untypical British upbringing, you could say. Growing up, we were looking at the rise of the English Defence League in our town. I remember at the age of 11 being told you can't go into the town centre because the EDL are in town. And so politics and history and understanding our place in Britain was something that we couldn't ignore. It was in our face. We were learning about stereotypes, we were hearing about events overseas in the Middle East, and politics was something that a lot of us tried to understand why is it that there are people in this country who detest our existence? How did we arrive in Britain? What's our story like? How did areas like Luton change over time? And so I was always interested in history and politics, and I went to Warwick and I studied history and politics. And we did modules on migration, we looked at race, we looked at anti-racism, and I felt a lot of the narrative portrayed South Asians as passive victims. There was a lot of talk about fantastic people in the anti-fascist left. There was very little discussion about organising within the South Asian communities, and I'd heard stories from people anecdotally about fighting back against the far right, trying to defend communities. And so that is what sparked my interest in trying to record some of these stories, documenting acts of resistance. And so I started just by interviewing people who were involved in organising the self-defence of communities in the 70s and 80s. And what I found was these people weren't just organising the self-defence of their communities, they were very, very political. They were anti-imperialists, they had class consciousness, they linked their struggles in Britain with what was happening in South Africa and Palestine and Ireland. And I wanted to try and understand, where does that come from? Where's that tradition come from? And I came across this man on the screen, Sivanandan, fantastic Sri Lankan intellectual, very involved in the publication Race Today. He was the director of an institute called the Institute for Race Relations, and he tried to theorize about our existence in Britain, and he linked the South Asian presence in Britain with the empire. And I think to truly understand the history of South Asian political organizing, we have to start in the empire itself. And so we're here because there is a reference to exactly that Britain had gone to the Indian subcontinent and colonized the subcontinent. Much of Britain's wealth, much of its progress in its industrial revolution was financed by the deliberate deindustrialization of the Indian subcontinent. And again, in India, they weren't passive victims either. In 1857, we have an uprising in the subcontinent, which is also known as the Indian Mutiny. And it's suppressed very violently by the Brits. And many have this memory of that colonial violence. There are winners and losers under British colonialism. They create a class of zamindars who are the landowners. And what that essentially means is people who initially worked their land as farmers are now landless labourers. And so you have this division of labour emerging in the subcontinent. So you do have an elite class that emerges within the subcontinent, but you also have a majority that are basically being screwed over, economically speaking. And it's really interesting in Bengal, which was where Calcutta was the colonial capital, the British pioneered the English education system. And the thinking was that if we have an English education system, we create a loyal class who would be subservient to British rule. And what actually happens is when you have these students reading liberal ideas, the ideas of the concept of rights, the concept of just rule, they start to question, well, how just is this British rule? This isn't very liberal. You preach liberalism, you preach individual liberty and rights, but you're acting against our own interests. And so we have in Bengal the Bengal Renaissance. In 1905, things come to a head when the Brits try to partition Bengal into East Bengal and West Bengal. And East Bengal is dominated by Muslims and West Bengal is dominated by Hindus. And many people see this as an attempt at divide and rule. And so we start to see an emerging nationalist movement calling for self-rule, calling for the boycott of British cloth, calling for the boycott of British businesses, encouraging self-sufficiency. And so you have this wave of nationalism in the Indian subcontinent. You've got the rise of the Congress Party, but you've also got people who are critical of the Indian Congress Party saying, we want you to be more radical. And there's people carrying out assassinations during this period as well. And to try and understand the link between Britain and the Indian subcontinent, it's worth understanding the history of the Lascars. Now, the Lascars was a name given to seafarers, South Asian seafarers who worked on British ships. Often when Britain would go into the subcontinent, many white sailors would die on the voyage, so they would take South Asians, they would recruit them in places like Gujarat and Bengal and make them work on the ships. And if you look at the photo, it looks like they're doing a job they quite enjoy. They're dressed in their traditional wear, but actually the reality of being a Lascar was torture on these ships. It was very common for Lascars to be tortured. There was a colonial stereotype about South Asians being able to withstand extreme heat, and they were often working in the bunkers of the ships, shoveling coal. Many of them died on the voyage as well. There was a lot of disease. They were mistreated on the ships, often by their own people, it has to be said. There was another class emerged called the Sarangs, who would often recruit the Lascars onto the ships, and they were almost in a sort of supervisor role. And they would often cheat Lascars of their wages. And often when the ships arrived in the ports of Liverpool and Glasgow and Cardiff and East London, the ship owners felt they had no responsibility for the Lascars who joined them on the voyage. And many of them would sometimes be left abandoned on the streets of London to fend for themselves. Some were tortured so badly that they would jump overboard and try and make ends meet in Britain. And there are various newspaper reports from the 1800s of these Indian seafarers, these Lascars, dying on the streets of London in the cold There was one Times newspaper article in the 1840s talking about 40 sons of India found dead in the cold. And this is where we see the emergence of the initial South Asian working class, because in the port cities of Liverpool and Cardiff and South Shields and Hull, you start to see the emergence of these seafarers who'd escaped from their ships. Some of them resort to begging, some of them resort to selling goods door to door, and very few places are going to offer them employment during this period. You also at this time have Africans and Arabs also working on the ships. So you have very multicultural parts of Britain in places like Butetown, in Cardiff, in Aldgate in East London. And you know, so often when people think about the South Asian presence in Britain, we think post Second World War, when actually there's a whole history of struggle prior to the Second World War. And the Lascars were one of those groups, working class seafarers who struggled. And the second image that we've got, the Lascars only with Bengali text, I believe, is from a dock in Glasgow. I think it was from the 1880s. Again, it's really funny nowadays. You get reform and conservative politicians talking about, multiculturalism and signage in different languages. This is from the 1880s, and it just goes to show that the history of migrants, the history of South Asians, the history of black people is intrinsically tied to Britain. And so, when people complain and have these moral panics about different languages, they don't understand this history of colonialism, this history of relying on the labour of South Asians in this country for so many years. Now, this house, 65 Cromwell Avenue, you can still see it today, is in Highgate, North London. It's one of the wealthiest parts of the UK. This house was a hub for Indian revolutionaries in Britain in 1905. And very few people know about these revolutionaries or what this house was actually used for. And the story of this house is there was a man called Shyamji Krishna Varma, who was a wealthy lawyer, a barrister in the Indian subcontinent. And he'd been taken in by this wave of Indian nationalism, and he'd been advocating for self-rule. And now at that time in the subcontinent, you had all sorts of repression of revolutionaries. People were being imprisoned. If you were associated with an assassination, whether you'd written something in a newspaper justifying violence against an oppressor, you could be imprisoned. And so he moved to London in 1897 to Muswell Hill. He was very wealthy. He'd married into, I think he'd married the daughter of a cotton mill owner. And he used his wealth in the struggle for independence. And so he set up the Indian Home Rule League Society in North London. And he also set up a publication called the Indian Sociologist, which was a monthly newspaper advocating for independence. And in 1905, he purchased this property because he knew that there were many Indian students arriving in Britain. Back then, if you wanted to qualify as a barrister in places like Bombay, you had to have a British qualification. It was often seen as a passport to power. So he knew that there were a number of Indian students arriving in Britain, many of them who had been exposed to these liberal ideas in their universities. And he tried to recruit them in the struggle for independence. He knew at the time that many landlords would refuse to rent to South Asians. And so he offered them scholarships on the basis that they would refuse to work for the British upon qualifying. But he also offered them this space for living. And so he starts to recruit Indian students into this building. And he's also connected to Irish Republicans at the time, Egyptian nationalists as well. He's forging links with different revolutionaries. And it was often easier, ironically, to agitate against empire in the heart of empire, because in the colonies you would face suppression. So you've got all sorts of different radical revolutionaries. You've got Egyptians calling for revolution there. You've got the Irish Republicans as well. And they're building these links and these solidarities, and they're learning techniques from one another. The idea of the Home Rule League Society came from the Irish. And so you've got this kind of cross-fertilization of ideas taking place. You've also, at this time, I mean, it's worth mentioning, there were very few South Asian women in Britain. The few South Asian women that did arrive often were either the ayahs, who were the servants from the subcontinent in the houses of the aristocrats, and they were often mistreated, and there were very few of them in number. And you had some wealthy South Asian women. One of them was a woman called Madam Kama, who again, like Shyamji Krishna Varma, came from a wealthy family, was quite radical. She came to India House and then she moved to Paris. And she did a similar thing in Paris, where she was hosting French socialists and Russian exiles in her house. And it was almost a model of India House in London. And really interesting, in 1907, she developed the first flag of Indian independence, which had red, green and yellow to signify the different religions of this subcontinent. And she waved the flag at the Socialist Congress in Germany in 1907. And it had the slogan Bande Mataram, which means glory be to the motherland. And she was basically a secular anti-imperialist socialist in 1907 in Germany, calling on socialists to support Indian independence. And again, connecting with people from other countries as well. In 1907, a man arrives at India House, a young firebrand called Savarkar. He's a very intelligent young man, very powerful speaker, and he takes the India House radicals into a more violent direction. So he starts agitating for armed revolution in the subcontinent. Every Sunday he hosts talks. They start learning revolver shooting at a shooting range in Tottenham Court Road. They install a rifle range in the garden of India House. And we know about this, by the way, because the British state spied on these people. There are surveillance files in the British Library archives at the moment. They've got a thick folder on India House where they surveilled all of these individuals, and they raised alarm about what these guys are up to. So they were smuggling weapons into the subcontinent. They were doing bomb-making workshops in the garden. And this guy is very radical, really influencing quite a few people in India House, so much so that the British actually plant spies and informers in India House to try and challenge them. In 1909, one of the India House radicals, a man called Madan Lal Dhingra, assassinates a British official who worked for the Secretary of State for India. And from that point onwards, India House is being shut down by the British authorities. Savarkar is on the run. They frame him on charges saying he's agitating against the empire. And it's really interesting because Savarkar ends up in the Andaman Islands, where he signs mercy petitions promising not to agitate against the British. And it doesn't take long for Savarkar's anti-imperialism to morph into a more far-right Hindu nationalism. And today Savarkar is hailed as the founding ideologue of the Hindu far-right in India. And if you look at Modi and individuals around Modi and the RSS in India today, they commemorate people like Savarkar. It's quite ironic, it was Modi who went to Switzerland to get the ashes of Shyamji Krishna Varma, who was way more secular than the modern Hindu far-right. So they are claiming very radical revolutionaries. Yes, people like Savarkar moved into the direction of Hindu nationalism, but a lot of these revolutionaries who took those violent means were actually not Hindu nationalists, were very secular. In fact, Shyamji Krishna Varma had gone to events around the pan-Islamic societies in London at the time and tried to forge links with Muslim communities as well. Some of the scholarships he named after Mughal emperors. We had Sikhs and Muslims living side by side in this house, agitating for independence as well. And so it's a really interesting story about how we are taught about the independence struggle and how historical figures are claimed by different people, but they'd like to ignore the awkward parts when it comes to things like secularism. I mean, even Madame Kama in Paris, who hailed the flag, was a secularist who believed in uniting different religious communities against the British. And, the anti-colonial struggle continued. And we know in Manchester you had the Pan-African Congress here in 1945. Indians also hosted all sorts of events demanding independence. In 1938, we have a group of Punjabi labourers. In the 1930s and 40s, a lot of Punjabis from rural Punjab moved to Britain, and they work as door-to-door salesmen known as peddlers. Very few of them are given opportunities in industry because there's a lot of racism, especially during the Great Depression in the 30s. And obviously we've had the 1919 racist riots in the port cities as well. Few trade unions are willing to represent Asian workers. The National Union of Seamen are trying to launch campaigns against the employment of Lascar seafarers on the ships. When there were riots in Glasgow in 1919, the Trades Union Congress passes a motion condemning Asiatic labour, not the violence against the black and Asian communities, but the idea that you can have black and Asian people working in Britain. And so there's a long history of trade unions failing to represent workers and workers taking matters into their own hands and setting up their own institutions. And the Indian Workers Association in 1938, as well as agitating for independence, they were also trying to represent Asian workers, supporting them with housing, putting on events and things like that. They never wanted separate unions of black and Asian people. They always wanted to work within the existing trade union structures, but they were often denied the opportunity to join trade unions. And that's an almighty struggle that we see continues into the post-war period. Just before I talk about Malcolm X in the Midlands and the post-war period, it's also worth mentioning the union organising activities of the seafarers. We have a man, Shapurji Saklatwala. He's elected as an MP in Battersea in 1924, I believe, and he's elected as Labour's first MP of colour. He's also a communist. At that point, for a very brief period, you could be a communist and a Labour Party member. I don't think you can even be a socialist these days. I mean, they make it very hard. But he was a man who, again, came from wealthy background, but he was committed to the struggles of working class people of all backgrounds. In Parliament, he spoke on Irish republicanism a number of times, supporting the Irish. But he tried to recruit seafarers, Indian seafarers, into a new union called the International Oriental Seafarers Union. It was ultimately unsuccessful. These people were in very precarious positions. And later on after him, we have others, Surat Ali, we have others trying to recruit them into an organisation called the Colonial Seamen's Union. I think by the late 1930s, they get 6,000 members. And they have a presence in Cardiff, in Liverpool, in Glasgow, in the East End as well. By this point, you've got a significant Bengali presence in Aldgate, East London. And it's in 1939 that they have their first success, and that's partly because we're on the brink of the Second World War. They have a lot more leverage power now. They could paralyse Britain's maritime operations. And they also connected with seafaring unions around the world, actually. So they connected with people in Karachi, in other ports where the British Empire have seafarers. The seafarer numbers are much higher. 50,000 South Asian seafarers, I believe, worked on the British ships. And they find out that the white sailors are getting a war bonus, but they're not getting anything. And so they refuse to work on their ships. And many of the shipping companies eventually concede, though there are some seafarers who are arrested because they're in very precarious positions, and there's an almighty fight to try and end that imprisonment as well. And it just goes to show that, throughout this period, even when the odds were stacked against them, South Asians were trying to organise themselves. They were fighting back against injustice. They saw themselves as part of a broader working class, even if elements of the working class rejected their presence. And that continues on to the post-war period. It's worth just saying, just as Britain's white working class communities were built around industries, the South Asians who arrived in the post-war period, their communities were also built around the factories, mills and the foundries that depended on their labour. In the post-war period, we have a number of labour shortages across different industries. London Transport are recruiting directly from the Caribbean at this point. And in Southall, there is the Wolves Rubber Factory. And the boss of the factory, he'd served in Punjab as a soldier. He recruits lots of Punjabis to work in this rubber factory in Southall. Initially, they're living in Aldgate and parts of East London where you already have a presence, but then they're doing very long shifts, they're working overtime, and so a lot of them move to Southall for these job opportunities. And the Southall that we know today comes from that history of these people being recruited to work in one particular factory. And that's where we also see the first, one of the first big strikes involving South Asians. And it's worth just saying many of these Punjabis who'd arrived in Southall came with their politics. Punjab was an area that had seen peasant rebellions. It was also where we'd seen the Amritsar massacre of 1919. And people had memories of the violence that the Brits had unleashed upon South Asians. In fact, there was a man called Udham Singh who'd witnessed the violence in Amritsar in 1919, and he wanted revenge, and so he actually moved to America initially, because in America, Punjabis in America had joined something called the Ghadar Party, and the Ghadar Party was another revolutionary group, a bit like the India House Radicals, working class Punjabis. One of the guys who'd set up the Ghadar Party was actually involved in India House. His name was Lala Har Dayal, and they knew that they had a lot of Punjabis working in the British Army, and so Ghadar meant mutiny, and they thought they could spark a mutiny. It was ultimately unsuccessful. There wasn't great tactics. They had their own newspapers, but they had a global presence. They had members in all areas where you had South Asians. And Udham Singh, who'd witnessed the massacre in Amritsar, had got involved with the Ghadar Party, and he wanted to assassinate the Lieutenant Governor of the Punjab, Colonel O'Dwyer, who'd approved of the actions, who'd approved of the massacre. And so he actually moved to Britain at one point. He'd been imprisoned in India for about 5 years as well. And he lived an almost nomadic existence. He worked as a peddler, door-to-door salesman in Southampton and Canterbury. He worked as a film extra in Denham in Buckinghamshire. And when the opportunity came about, he assassinated this colonel. So 2 assassinations on British soil in the name of the Indian independence struggle. And a lot of the Punjabis knew about Udham Singh, and so in Southall they would have portraits of him and they would commemorate him and say he was a freedom fighter and he fought for our independence. And many of them had come from regions of Punjab where the Communist Party were very strong. In fact, one of the leading IWA members said there was a big red flag that used to fly in his village, and a lot of people would be recruited into the Communist Party. So when they arrived in Britain, they would join the Communist Party as well. And that helped them massively in terms of learning from the communists, drawing links with communists in Britain. And so they set about recruiting Punjabis in the Wool's rubber factory in Southall into the Transport and General Workers Union. And they'd gone door to door. It was a very sort of anti-union factory, Wool's rubber factory. They'd gone door to door. They'd made people swear on religious books that they would stand with each other, and they had a significant presence by 1963. I think 452 people had been recruited into the Transport and General Workers Union. And they'd gone on strike when 10 active union members had been dismissed. And they'd won significant concessions as well. They'd won an increase in pay. They'd won a new grievance procedure as well. But the management eventually would break these procedures. And there was one occasion in 1965 where one of their members had reported a supervisor for stealing things from the factory. And because he'd reported him, the supervisor said, well, you came in 10 minutes late, and sacked him. And so the workers went on strike in defense of their comrade. And they went on strike for a number of weeks. The Transport and General Workers Union refused to make the strike official. And so they weren't getting strike pay, and so they were relying on the community of Southall to waive rent, to provide groceries on credit. The Gurdwara raised £1,500, which was a significant amount at the time. But because the union had not made the strike official, when the truck drivers would come in to the Wool's rubber factory and call and say, are we crossing a picket line? They say, well, no, it's not official. We've not really backed it. And so that had caused a big problem, and it decreased their leverage power. And they actually lost the 1965 strike. despite all of that community mobilisation. And it was the same story in Lancashire. In Preston, we had the Red Scar Mills strike. Again, people had joined the union, Transport General Workers Union, and what had happened was the union had basically made a deal. The union management had made a deal with the employer, and the deal was that they would increase the workload by 50% for a 3% increase in their wages. And the workers said, well, this isn't on, and the Pakistani and Indian workers staged an impromptu sit-in for like 17 hours in this mill, and the machines got clogged, and they abandoned it for 1 month, and it was an impromptu strike. A month later, they just came in and they said, well, we're going to impose this whether you like it or not. And so these workers went on strike. Again, the union failed to support them. You had Michael X, who was involved in the Black Nationalists at the time, coming in and giving them great speeches, but there wasn't any real sense of how to organise in the workplace. You had some Pakistanis who threatened to go on hunger strike on the steps of Downing Street. There were all sorts of tactics being used, but ultimately they were unsuccessful. And again, it was because the unions had failed to back the workers. And this is a pattern that repeats itself. What's interesting in the Midlands is where you have a big Indian Workers Association presence in places like Birmingham and Coventry and Wolverhampton, is the unions never had a massive presence in the foundries where a lot of Punjabis worked. And what that meant was, in a lot of other industries where they try to impose colour bars, especially on the buses and places like that, they never had this issue in the foundries. So a lot of South Asians, Punjabis, worked in the foundries, and it recruited people into the unions. And I think also because they had the links with the Communist Party as well, they were able to have a lot more influence. So in the foundries of the Midlands in the 60s, they were way more successful when it came to strikes. And you had people like Jagmohan Joshi, Avtar Singh Johal, who recently passed away. These guys were formidable IWA leaders who recruited masses of foundry workers into the foundries. And they helped to desegregate the foundry toilets, for instance. There was a time when Asian workers couldn't use toilets that were reserved for white people, and so they would say to them, they had one supervisor who would like guard the white toilet, and they would just get their members to move him out of the way and take direct action and just break all the rules essentially, and said, you know, we're not having this. We're people who will fight back in the workplace, and we're going to champion our rights. And you know, it's worth saying the Indian Workers Association across the country was very, very influential. In Southall by the 1960s, there were 5 slates competing for elections just for the Indian Workers Association. They were using local schools for polling booths. And there was all sorts of factionalism. Nobody ever gets away from factionalism. They had 5 different slates. There were fierce contests. The Observer paper wrote about Little India goes to the polls in 1965. And I think half of the Punjabis in some parts of Southall were members of the Indian Workers Association. And you have to understand it by thinking about the fact that a lot of these guys are young men. The Indian Workers Association provides you with a social life. They are organising social events. If you need help with housing, there's a lot of housing discrimination. They're helping you with housing. The educated members will translate things for you. They'll help you fill in forms. It's very beneficial as a migrant to Britain, whether you have your politics or not, to join the Indian Workers Association. And I think there is that process of politicisation where people see it as fulfilling a social and welfare function, but actually they're also giving you the politics. And so a lot of these people in Southall, in the Midlands and Lancashire, they practice communal living. Because of the discrimination that they faced, you would have 21 people in a 3-bedroom house at times. They would take shifts on the beds. And that means when the Indian Workers Association calls a meeting, there's no hiding. They will find you. And so, you might have a meeting in the front room and you've got to come down. And that's how it was. It was very tight-knit communities. You had a lot of people who didn't really want to be that political. And it's worth saying that the communists would always dominate the Indian Workers Association, but the rank and file members, a lot of them might not have been that into it, but that was the dominant force in a lot of these places. In the Midlands, the Jagmohan Joshi, who was the secretary of the Birmingham Indian Workers Association, he was very influenced by the Black Power movement. And at this time in the Midlands, the colour bar still existed in the pubs and clubs. even a haircut would be out of bounds. And so he'd seen what the civil rights movement were doing to fight the colour bar, and he was very influenced. He also had a connection with African Caribbean groups in Britain. There was quite a lot of solidarity between the black and Asian communities. In fact, they were all described as black. Back then, the concept of political blackness, it wouldn't raise an eyebrow. If today I tell a young Pakistani person, you're black, say, what are you talking about? And the same with young Africans. But back then it was very normal because the racism was dished out. It didn't matter what colour you are. If you were an African, you're getting called the P word. If you're brown skinned like me, you're getting called the N word. That's how it was. And it was that shared injustice and that shared struggle that united communities around this concept of political blackness. Very influential banner under which a lot of communities organised. And so Malcolm X came to the Midlands. He came to Smethwick. I think he was in the UK to do a talk at the London School of Economics. And the Indian Workers Association coordinated his visit. And so he came to Smethwick, and a year prior, the Tories had won an election under the racist slogan, if you want an N-word for your neighbour, vote Labour. And there was a lot of racism in Smethwick at the time. It was a huge moral panic around Asians living in certain areas and white residents on Marshall Street. They had a campaign asking the council to buy the houses so they don't let them out to black and Asian families. And Malcolm X walked down this street and said, I was in Birmingham, Alabama. Now I'm going to be in Birmingham in the UK and see if it's any different. And he got a lot of abuse from people on the street. And he carried on regardless. And it was quite a big moment of solidarity with the communities. Malcolm X, a towering figure in the civil rights movement, comes to your street in Smethwick, and he unites the struggles. And Avtar Singh Johar later said it was like a shot in the arm for the anti-racist struggle. They'd sat down together after his visit in one of the pubs, which was one of the pubs where they enforced the colour bar, and I think they had to go to like the smoking room just to sit down. But Malcolm X's visit to Smethwick was significant because the ideas that Malcolm X had about self-defense, about organising for yourself, about reforming your own community were very, very powerful. And this was also the era, a few years later, where we have Enoch Powell making his Rivers of Blood speech in Birmingham. And it's worth remembering that at that time, Enoch Powell wasn't some fringe figure. He was the most popular politician in Britain. And he wasn't ignorant about South Asia either. He spoke fluent Urdu. And he had actually tried to create this atmosphere of hate. And it spread in East London, in the docks, the decaying dock areas. You had people, dockers, marching in support of Enoch Powell. You had meat porters marching in support of Enoch Powell as well. On the buses in parts of West Bromwich, I think in 1955, you had trade union members going on strike to enforce a colour bar. And so this was a very common attitude that we are being taken over. And it's interesting just to think about some of the headlines we get today, right? About being taken over, or it's too much, it's the scale of it's too much. Back then, this was the exact same rhetoric, that the scale of it's too much. And then we have the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which restricts immigration from the colonies. And it was always seen as the colour problem, that in order to legislate for good race relations, we need to clamp down on migration from parts of Africa and South Asia. And so they linked race relations with immigration policy. And that constant debate about immigration meant that if you were an immigrant, you were going to be targeted. It was non-stop in the press, on the telly. And South Asians were receiving a lot more violence as well, black and South Asian communities. I mean, you'd had earlier riots in Notting Hill and Nottingham, the Teddy Boys targeting West Indians in particular. But now you were getting a lot more racist attacks. One of the guys that I've interviewed, Balwinder Rana, he set up the Kent Asian Youth Federation in 1969. And that was partly a response to the rise of Enoch Powell. He remembers as a college student at the age of 16, people laughing at him in the common room saying Enoch Powell was right. And he set up the Youth Federation. They'd go and protect families facing racist attacks in Gravesend, which had a growing Punjabi Sikh community. And they also had their internationalism. Again, it's interesting, the majority of these people were Indians, Punjabi Indians, and they were raising money for a cyclone that had taken place in Bangladesh. And I just think to now some of the tensions we're hearing about between India and Pakistan. Back then, the high commissioners are meeting, you've got Punjabi Sikhs raising money for Bangladeshis, and there is that sense of togetherness. And there's a great story that he tells me actually where they wouldn't get served drinks in the pub in Gravesend, and they had just had an event celebrating Indian independence, so there was quite a lot of them in the room, and they said, why don't we all go to the pub and order some pints? And because we're such a big number, what they're going to do. So he went into the pub and he saw the barmaid who would always refuse to serve him, and he said, can I have 50 pints of lager, please? And she looked at him, and then she sees this group of Indians coming into the pub, and she's running around like a headless chicken because she doesn't know what to do, because now they're organized. There's not just one person coming in on a Friday, they're all coming in together, and that's how they're challenging the colour bar. In the Midlands, Jagmohan Joshi and the IWA, they worked with white left-wing students. So the white left-wing student would go into the pub and order the pints, and then they would pick them up from them, and they would say, oh no, you can't do that. And it was things like that, that the different techniques to try and tear apart at this colour bar. And of course, then you later have legislation outlawing discrimination. But it was because the community is organised against that discrimination that governments then changed the legislation around discrimination. So this woman, Jaya bin Desai, one of the most inspiring South Asian women in Britain, she was involved in a strike in 1976 at Grunwick Film Processing Factory in northwest London. And just before I talk about that strike, it's just worth mentioning that in the sort of late 1960s, early 1970s, you have a number of arrivals from East Africa because of the Africanization policies and South Asians being kicked out by people like Idi Amin in Uganda. And there's a big moral panic. Again, all the papers are talking about an Asian invasion. Leicester City Council puts out front page headline in Uganda saying, don't come to Leicester. And then loads of them come to Leicester because they think, what's happening in Leicester? What's Leicester all about? And you have, you know, East African Indians. A lot of them were quite middle class. They'd done quite well in Africa. But when they came to Britain, their qualifications weren't recognised. Even if they could speak fluent English, they wouldn't get those middle class jobs. And so they found themselves on the same factory floors and the same mills and the same foundries as these Punjabi labourers. And so class divisions broke down when you came to Britain. Even if you had a qualification or you had fluent English, because of the discrimination at the time, you weren't getting those jobs. And so we have a number of strikes involving a lot of these people. In 1972, we have a strike at the Mansfield Hosiery Mill in Loughborough. This is a strike that's actually won. And one of the reasons it's won is because these South Asians, firstly, they club together, but they also occupy the union offices and say, if you're not going to represent us, we're going to give you guys a headache. And the South Asians at that factory were being denied knitting roles, and they fought for better roles, better pay, and they win that strike. In 1974, we have the Imperial Typewriter strike in Leicester. This is a strike that's unfortunately not won. Again, the union failed to represent the workers, the Transport and General Workers Union, and you also have external forces. So you have there's a man called Benny Bunsey, who's a South African exile who advised the people in Loughborough 2 years earlier. He's advising this new strike committee and saying, we need to organise. I mean, when I think about that strike in 1974, you had, I think, 1,100 of the 1,600 workers were South Asian, and the South Asian women were at the bottom of the hierarchy. And that strike wasn't necessarily just about pay and conditions, it was about dignity. A lot of the South Asian women people would just shout oi at them, they would click their fingers at them, they'd call them names, they would face racist abuse, they'd be pushed when they're queuing up for work, and they couldn't take that humiliation and that treatment. And it's really interesting that even though the strike was lost despite the support of the community, when one of the Asian women went back to the factory, the foreman, the supervisor, was laughing at her and saying, what a waste of money, you lost all your money, you went on strike, what was the point? And she said, well, there was a point, because now I know how to fight against you. You used to make me cry, now I'm going to make you cry, and I'm going to fight back, and I'm not afraid to stand up to you. I know how it works. And it was that introduction to trade union organising. There was a greater sense of militancy. This was also a time when the National Front were really building up a presence in Southall and Leicester and other places. And they tried to intimidate the South Asian women on the picket lines. And you also had, at this time, second generation emerging, young men protecting the strikers, supporting them. A lot of police violence on the picket lines as well. And that was a big theme in the Grunwick strike, actually. This was the first strike where you start to see the broader labour movement supporting South Asians going on strike. And again, at Grunwick, these people were treated horribly by management. They would often have a board writing down names of people who were working hard. It was almost like a competition. If your name's not on the board, if you're not working hard, you might get sacked. And they deliberately recruited Asian women who new arrivals. They'd gone door to door leafleting in the area in Brent, saying you can get jobs here. And white workers were starting to leave because it was just really poorly paid. I mean, it's no different to today. A lot of the warehouses on 0-hour contracts are people, newer migrants are the people working there. And so they thought they could exploit these women and they could increase their targets in this place. And back then, if you took a photo, you'd need to get the film processed, and this was one of the places where you do it. So it's a very important factory. It's in a residential area. And there's a moment comes where Jaya bin Desai is quite frustrated with how things are going. They're being denied the right to use the toilet. They're being told they don't need to go to their doctor's appointments. And she's being asked to stay for overtime, and she refuses. Her son has a similar problem with the manager being horrible to him. And there's a point where the manager says to her son, you guys are like animals in a zoo. And he turns around and says, this isn't a zoo. This isn't a factory, it's a zoo. There are many different types of animals in a zoo. Some are monkeys that will dance on your fingertips. Others are lions who will bite your head off. We are the lions, Mr. Manager. And that's where we start to see the emergence of a group of workers taking strike action. And they go on strike because they want union recognition and they want to join a union. The union that they're able to join is Apex, which is quite a right-wing union. And they actually, the rank and file members go up and down the country trying to get support from other workers. And the argument is this isn't just about us as Asian women in this warehouse, in this factory. This is about the right to join a union. And at this time, there's a big debate in the public around the concept of the social, the social contract, the idea that people are able to join a union and get better rights. And there's a big kind of move to kind of clamp down on the power of the organised labour movement. And so we start to have these mass pickets outside Grunwick. And you also had leadership from some trade union leaders. Arthur Scargill, the National Union of Mine Workers, instructs his members from Yorkshire and other places to go down and support the women. And says this is a fight for the working class. It's interesting that he later revealed that there were people within the TUC and other places telling him not to get involved. And so it took that leadership and that bravery from others in the labour movement to support these women. And there's mass violence on the picket lines from the police. The Special Patrol Group, which was originally used in Northern Ireland, and then later used in Southall actually, against Asians. They are being deployed against these women, and they're fighting back, and they're seeing white dockers, white miners. In Cricklewood, the postal workers say they're going to refuse to handle the mail, which is a very powerful act of solidarity that could have actually destroyed Grunwick's management. But then you have these right-wing associations who are trying to clamp down on unions, launching legal challenges and all sorts of things like that. And so that solidarity action is ultimately defeated. But they go on fighting. It eventually gets to a point where the TUC and Apex, the union, decide that the strike is unwinnable because of all of these legal complications. And the workers feel like they've been let down. And so they actually launched a hunger strike for one day outside the Trade Union Congress headquarters at one point towards the end of their dispute. And it's interesting how Grunwick is remembered, because it's sometimes almost celebrated as a victory when actually the strike was lost. And yes, there were people within the trade union movement now standing shoulder to shoulder with these Asian women. But we cannot ignore some of the problems that existed in terms of defending the rights of these workers. And you know, if we think now where we are today when it comes to Asian workers in Britain, where we have the Imperial Typewriters factory, we now have sweatshops where Asian women are given £3-4 an hour, mistreated, often by Asians, it has to be said, as well. And you know, these are things for us to think about, that these people fought against those practices 30, 40 years ago, and they're still occurring today. We've got a growing class divide within the South Asian community. And it's interesting, in the 80s, we see a number of industrial disputes where Asian workers are going up against Asian bosses. And so when we try and understand race equality, racism today, and class, we have to recognize that complication as well. That within the South Asian community, you have the landlord class and the renters, you have the bosses and the workers. And I think sometimes when we think about race and representation, we ignore those nuances as well. I want to talk a bit about the 80s. We now have a growing South Asian presence across Britain. We have the second generation. A lot of them are facing racist bullying in school. We have a rise in racist murders. In 1976, a young boy called Gurdeep Singh Chaggar is murdered on the streets of Southall, just outside the Dominion Cinema, which is owned by the Indian Workers Association. And Suresh Grover, young South Asian, was walking past, and he says to the officer, "Well, what happened there? There's a pool of blood." And the officer says, "Well, that's just Indian blood, nothing to worry about, on your way." And he's angry. Suresh Grover grew up in Nelson in Lancashire. He faced racism. I think he got stabbed at a young age. He'd moved to Southall, and he was sick and tired of seeing this police in action against racist murders. The South Asians had been calling for the police to take action against racist murders for over 20, 30 years. They'd been calling on the police, please take action, please do something about it. And often they would be on the receiving end of that police violence, as was the case at Grunwick and other places. And so the Southall youth, the young Asians, who are sick and tired of being treated horribly at school. They're also being bussed out, by the way. Back then, there was this moral panic around too many Asians in school. So they would be bussed out to like predominantly white schools and go there and maybe facing racist bullying as well. And they were sick and tired and said, we're not going to have this. We're going to defend our own communities. And so we see the Southall youth movement emerges, where young South Asians are now actively defending their communities from the racists. Whenever the National Front would march, they would oppose them. And they have run-ins with the police as well. They believe that the police themselves are perpetuators of racism, often stopping them, often targeting them. And so we have the emergence of the Southall youth movement in 1976. And up and down the country, we see similar movements emerging, particularly around the 1980s. In 1978, Taj Ali, a Bangladeshi worker, is murdered in East London, and the Bengali youth, a lot of them who had memories of fighting against Pakistan in the War of Independence, they're now mobilizing in the East End, fighting against the National Front. There is a level of coordination between the Bangladeshi youth in East London and the Southall youth. And in Yorkshire, in the north of England, we have the Bradford Asian Youth Movement, we have the Manchester Asian Youth Movement, Sheffield Asian Youth Movement. And it's interesting that in the north of England, these Asian youth movements become very, very political. In Southall, there was often a slogan of no politics. They got quite tired of some of the elders in the Indian Workers Association fighting with each other over different political parties in India. And they said, we don't want any of that. We just want to defend our communities. We couldn't care about party politics. But up north, in places like Bradford and Manchester and Sheffield, they're starting to read the words of the intellectual that I spoke about earlier, Sivanandan. They're seeing, the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers in America. They're listening to the speeches of Malcolm X, and they're connecting the struggle against racism with the struggle against imperialism. A lot of the young people in Bradford, for instance, were Kashmiri, and so they had an attachment to the struggle of the Kashmiris. They had a solidarity with the people of Ireland. It was often the Irish who would support them in many of these struggles as well, so they built links with them as well. And so they tried to understand their place in Britain. As young South Asian youth facing racism, they would adopt those slogans, we're here because you were there, here to stay, here to fight, come what may, we're here to stay. And it was this idea that where the elder generation kind of saw themselves as, we're going to come to Britain, we're going to work in some factories and foundries, we're going to get some money and we're going to go back home. Now you have family settlers and they're saying, no, we are British, we were born in Britain. We're not apart from British society, we live in Britain and we're here to stay. And so they're far more assertive. In Sheffield, you have a house codenamed the Bus Shelter, where you have a thick folder called the Fascist File, where they would find out where all the fascists lived, and they would target the fascists, they would attack the fascist houses, as well as defending themselves. They would get into scraps with the fascists. They had training, they had a mini gym in the house as well, and they were listening to the talks of all of these revolutionaries. And they were, again, as much as they were organising as South Asian youth, they saw themselves as part of that broader working class. And I think that's best exemplified by the 1984 miners' strike. The South Asians in Sheffield didn't live that far away from Orgreave, where you had the pickets. And it's really interesting during the miners' strike, the role of the South Asian community. There was very few South Asians who worked as miners. There were a few in Nottingham, but they had no connection to the industry. But there was this solidarity. In Birmingham, in Handsworth, Soho Road, one of the poorest parts of Birmingham, they would raise so much money for the miners that different mining lodges would fight with each other over who gets to have that patch when it comes to donations, because these poor Black and Asian communities were donating a lot of money to support the miners. In the Gurdwaras, they have this concept of langar, which is sharing food, and they embody those principles. So they would feed the miners and the miners' families in Nottingham. The Indian Workers Association in Yorkshire, they would travel to the mining villages during Christmas and give them toys. And there was this sense that these people have the same struggle as us, they're just as working class as us, and we need to stand in solidarity with them. So the Indian Workers Association are raising lots of money at this point. There's a story that I was told of an elderly Sikh couple in Southall who just done their Tesco shop, and when they saw people collecting for the miners, they just gave their whole trolley of shopping and did it again. And that was the kind of mentality at the time. In Sheffield, the Asian Youth Movement decided that they were going to go up to Orgreave in solidarity with the miners. And so Mukhtar Dar, one of the leading members of the Sheffield Asian Youth Movement, gets his minivan, and one of their members, Sadiq, I think it's like 5 a.m, and he gets pebbles and he throws it on his window and says, come on Sadiq, we're going to see the miners. And he wasn't really up for it, he's really tired, but he joins them. And when they get to the picket line at Orgreave, and excuse my language, one of the miners turns around and says, what the fuck are the Pakis doing here? And Sadiq says, Mukhtar, you got me up at 5 a.m, you ruined my sleep, and I come here and I'm getting racism from these guys, and now you expect me to stand with them for hours. What on earth is wrong with you? Like, have you lost your mind? And Mukhtar said something very powerful, and he said, well, brother, we can see the bars and they can't. That just because some of these people have racist views, we understand that just as we are a working class community linked to the means of production, who have dealt with police violence, who are angry with the scabs, the sellouts, the people within our own ranks who screw us over, these people are going through the exact same thing, and we need to build these alliances. It's very important for us. We are a minority in this country, and we need to build this as a broad working class movement. And that was a very powerful way of thinking. It's not easy, by the way, when you're dealing with racist murders, you're getting racial slurs all the time, to have that level of understanding. But that was their mindset. It wasn't this narrow identity politics of it's just our struggle and I'm more oppressed than you are. It was, let's try and find links between different communities. Let's try and build coalitions. We might not agree on everything, but we have a common interest here. And that was the ethos of the Asian youth movements. It was very much a class-conscious movement. And again, they would support South Asian workers against Asian bosses. And there's a really powerful story of Nottingham miners. I believe there were some miners in Nottingham who the South Asian workers had supported. And they'd heard of a strike in Birmingham. I think it was the Keywell Brothers clothing factory in 1984. Where the Asian women were working in sweatshops for an Asian boss. And these miners, who had no money, who were on strike over the miner strike, they sent 2 coaches to stand with Asian women in 1984. So white workers standing with Asian women against an Asian boss. And that was the level of solidarity. And to this day, a lot of the miners that I've spoken to and the families of miners say that was a profound period of understanding for a lot of people. In Wales, the black people support the miners would go and stand on the picket line with these Welsh miners. And I remember there was a story that someone told me of black and Asian members of black people support the miners. They went for pints in the pub after standing on the picket line. And there was a wife of a miner who broke down in tears. And she said to them that, I was taught to hate your people because of what I was reading in the Sun. I was taught that you guys are the problem, that you guys are the source of Britain's problems. And here you are standing with me when some of my neighbours won't stand with me. And by the end of the night, she's dancing with black and Asian people in a pub in a predominantly white part of Wales. And I think these stories are really, really powerful because when we think about 2025 and where we are today, we think that it's impossible to win people over, that some people will always have this racist mindset because they've never interacted with people. And I believe that people's minds can be changed. And I've seen that through some of these stories. That it requires a lot of work, it requires a lot of understanding, but this is what their mission was. They wanted communities to feel safer, and they recognized that commonality of struggle, and they linked their fights with what was happening overseas as well. They went to Ireland, they went to Belfast, the Asian Youth Movement sent a minibus to other parts of the country, and they tried to find allies when they had their struggles. And one of the biggest struggles was the struggle of the Bradford 12. In the early 1980s, there was a rumour that the National Front were planning to march in Manningham, which is a predominantly Asian part of Bradford. And members of the Bradford Asian Youth Movement, by this point they'd splintered into something called the United Black Youth League. They'd built petrol bombs, and the idea was that they were going to use these petrol bombs to try and deter the fascists from entering their areas. And this was, by the way, a time when you had a series of racist attacks. In Walthamstow, there was a firebombing of a home and people had died. You had the New Cross massacre as well. You had quite a lot of racial tension at the time. Everyone was on edge. A bit like last year, people were really on edge, didn't know what's going to come next. And the police found these petrol bombs and arrested them. And there was a big trial, and they argued that self-defense is no offense, that we weren't going to use these petrol bombs to harm anyone. We were just going to defend our communities. And they had people like Michael Mansfield and other top lawyers representing them, and they were just picking holes in the police argument. The police had made stuff up about these predominantly young men, and they'd pick holes in the police argument. They'd also highlight that the police had failed to actually tackle racist hate crime in Bradford. So what did you expect the young Asians to do was the argument. And they successfully won, and it was a very important legal case in British history. They argued the right to self-defense on the basis that the police had failed to protect a community. And so it exposed police racism, but it also demonstrated that all communities can organise and win, because on the face of it, nobody would think you'd win a trial like that. And they relied on a lot of solidarity during the Bradford 12 campaign. They went to the working men's clubs and got support. UB40 had promised to do a benefit gig. I think Bobby Sands in Ireland had offered his support. And again, building coalitions with different communities had been an important part of that victory as well. In Luton, we had the Luton Youth Movement. They would collect members from Southall and they would go to Leeds Crown Court to stand with people in support of the Bradford 12. So it was a national campaign up and down the country, fighting for the right to self-defence. And it's worth mentioning that the Asian youth movements were predominantly young men. They weren't perfect. There was an element of machoism in their ranks as well, sexism as well. Some were more progressive. Manchester's Asian youth movement had more women members and it was more organised. But it was predominantly young men. But there were some important women as well who had a big role to play in some of these campaigns. And one of them was Anwadita. She was from Rochdale. And she was told that her Pakistan-born children couldn't join her in Britain. And so she was denied, she was separated from her kids. And she launched a big campaign, the Anwadita Defence Campaign. She worked with the Asian youth movements as well, including here in Manchester. And she spoke at 400 meetings up and down the country. And she would dress in a salwar kameez, in a traditional South Asian wear. She would share platforms with the likes of Tony Benn and Arthur Scargill. She also connected her struggle to the struggle against South African apartheid. She spoke at anti-apartheid demonstrations in London. And she drew so much attention to her case that Granada TV did a documentary where they carried out blood tests and demonstrated that they were her children. And the Home Office were forced into an embarrassing U-turn. And even when the cameras were on her, she made sure to grab other Asian women who were going through similar immigration cases because she knew she had the press attention. And that was just a really, really powerful moment in the campaign against racist immigration laws. And Anwadita was involved in supporting all sorts of activities of the Asian youth movements as well. And that was the mindset. It wasn't just single issue campaigns. It was, we're going to organise under this umbrella as South Asians, and we're going to connect the struggles against deportations, family reunification, the horrific virginity testing that they had at Heathrow Airport. And you start to see the emergence of South Asian women's groups as well. In Southall, you have Southall Black Sisters, feminist group, who campaigned against a lot of these practices, but also things like domestic violence in households. You're dealing with a racist society at the same time. You're dealing with problems within the community where you have new arrivals of South Asian women being treated horribly in households. And so they did a lot of pioneering work to tackle some of those practices as well. You have the organisation of African and Asian women as well. And all of these organisations are now moving to actually tackle issues within the South Asian community as well. It's not just a battle against racism, but it's a battle to reform communities as well, to tackle problems that existed too. And so a lot of these campaigns continued apace into the 80s and 90s. But then what starts to happen is that the government decides that these guys are quite a threat. They'd seen the riots in 1981 and 85 and said, we need to now have bodies to tackle racism. Instead of leaving it to people in communities, we need to create these bodies to tackle racism. And a lot of the Asian youth movements and the radical anti-racist groups believe that this was the beginning of the end for a lot of this radical activity, because you have state multiculturalism emerging as a policy, and there's this idea that we will put money into diverse working class communities and that will solve the problem. And what often happens is you pit communities against each other. So you might say we will have something for the African community, an African community centre, the Bangladeshis can bid for a pot of funding for themselves, and suddenly different communities are now competing with each other for funding for their communities. And I think that still exists to this day, particularly with the kind of decline of, with austerity measures. We saw the rise of the third sector and what David Cameron called the big society. And now what we've got is different communities sort of organising as Bangladeshis or you know, with Nigerians or Pakistanis. And so we've seen the emergence of an identity politics. At the same time, on a state level, we've seen the emergence of these institutions, and the struggles moved. The anti-racist struggle has moved from the streets and the communities to the boardrooms and the executive offices. So you hear, you know, Reform and the right and Donald Trump talking about DEI. DEI is a big problem. The original critics of DEI were actually the Black and Asian communities, who said, you're making this about individuals now. This isn't about communities, this is about individuals. And this is a quote from Mukhtar Dar, who said, you know, the youth of the 80s were an almighty lion who could roar, and the system got scared and they created the race relations industry. And this is an example he gives. They smash your kneecaps with racism, and then they give you crutches in the form of grants to stand up on. And a lot of these organizations started taking state funding. Indian Workers Association, a lot of them took state funding. And what that means is when you start to take state funding, you dilute your politics a bit. Suddenly you might be less keen to talk about what's happening overseas in case you might lose your money. And you can just think about the Prevent agenda and all of this legislation. And also it's quite lucrative. People make a lot of money from it. And so what we start to see is a fracturing, where there are some organizations that say we refuse to take state funding because it will mean that we lose our autonomy and independence. And there's others who say, well, we should still take state funding because, you know, we're paying our taxes and it's important that the government invests in tackling racism. And so we start to see a split within different approaches on how to tackle racism. And it's a split that still continues to this day. I think the other big thing when we think about what has changed, and I mentioned it earlier, is the growing class divide within the South Asian community. We celebrate representation of individuals in the media, in politics, but how much have working class South Asian communities actually progressed? When Rishi Sunak is elected Prime Minister, or you know, Suella Braverman's Home Secretary or Priti Patel's Home Secretary, what does that actually mean for a Bangladeshi kid in East London who's seeing these big towers, Canary Wharf, going up around them? It's being, you know, the area is being gentrified. They're having to move out. They suffer some of the highest rates of child poverty in the country. They have some of the lowest earnings in the country as Bangladeshis in Britain. They were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, disproportionately live in overcrowded houses. If we celebrate diversity and race in those individual terms that a few people, you know, get through, then we miss the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is it's about communities. It's about working class communities having better conditions, living better lives. And I think when I think about the riots of 2024, I spent quite a great deal of time reporting on the riots. And it was interesting because a lot of people said it was about misinformation, that people, you know, after the horrific murders in Southport, that people had said, oh, the attacker was an illegal immigrant or a Muslim, when actually it'd been building for a long time. A lot of people have said, you know, racism's not in your face anymore, it's institutional. It is in your face if you're a Muslim woman who wears a hijab, and all three of my sisters who wear the hijab have faced racism, open, vicious racism. In Luton, at the Lake District, everywhere they've gone, they faced it. And so post 9/11, you've had the rise of Islamophobia, and you've also had this anti-refugee rhetoric. And so we had two moral panics emerging a year prior to the riots of 2024. One was the classic anti-immigrant rhetoric, right? Stop the boats, constantly referred to by politicians. The asylum seekers are coming through, even though the majority of migrants to Britain come by legal means, 96%. And they are people who've come because Britain has underpaid people in social care, in construction, in all of these industries, and they've relied on exploiting migrant workers who are treated horrifically, but whose stories are never told because of our anti-migrant hysteria, right? And so you have that, the rise of that anti-migrant sentiment. And then when people are marching for a ceasefire in Gaza, you have Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, talking about hate marches. You have the Daily Mail and others talking about an Islamist takeover of Britain. And all of that leads up to those racist riots. And as a historian, someone who looks at these events, I see the patterns. It's the constant pattern, whether it's the Great Depression and economic insecurity in working class communities, whether it's the Asian invasion newspaper articles from the 70s, and now TikTok, GB News, Twitter, the new tools used by the far right. It's the same thing over and over again. And it's interesting that 7 in 10 of the most deprived parts of Britain had racist rioting over the summer. And as much as racism was a factor, there was also this economic insecurity in white working class communities. And when you're smashing up shops in your own communities, trying to destroy libraries and communities, you have no pride in your community. And I think one of the biggest problems we have in our political discourse today is that people in places like Hartlepool and Doncaster and Liverpool and Middlesbrough, they are told that they are different to people in places like Luton and Bradford and Birmingham, even though we have the same material concerns, even though we deal with the same housing problems, even though we all suffer from bad public services and crumbling infrastructure, we all want to get appointments at the NHS. And I think the task ahead is to be able to say to predominantly white working class communities that we have the same problems as you do, and we need to come together as our communities and to actually take the fight to the people that are screwing us all over. And so it's very important. One of the purposes of recovering history is to actually make people understand the exploitation of South Asians, both under British rule in the colonies, when they came in the 50s and 60s, when they worked in the ships, and even today when they're working the worst jobs in the warehouses on 0-hour contracts. A lot of politicians talk about tackling racism. And racism is embedded in employment practices at the moment. Outsourcing, Mick Lynch very fantastically recently said that outsourcing institutionalizes racism in employment practices, because there are a lot of people, black and Asian workers, and you'll see it when it's the security at the civil service or the railway cleaners, predominantly black and Asian people in insecure, bogus self-employment, denied the right to sick pay, denied the right to annual leave. And these are also forms of racism in our employment practices that are screwing people over. And so there's a lot of work to be done to tackle racism, both challenging the media narratives, recovering the history of those who've come before us, but also challenging politicians in the present. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Any questions?
Yeah, so with reform, with the fascists, and our community being divided and depoliticised, how can we get politicised, how can we get united? What should we do?
I think the first thing is to understand who your typical reform voter is. Okay. I don't believe that the typical reform voter is a hardcore fascist. And I think there is a tendency for some to go into a community they're not from and say, you guys are Nazis, you guys are fascists scum off our street. There's a time and place for that. I think in certain scenarios where you do have really racist groups who are posing a threat, maybe there is a moment where you're defending your community. But there are a lot of people who have that economic insecurity that I mentioned earlier. When I think about Barnsley, which I think Reform are set to take all the seats in Barnsley, it had a big mining community. They lost their industry, they lost the community, really. They lost institutions built around industry. A lot of these places don't just have deprivation, they also have a lack of social infrastructure. And what I mean by that is your pubs, your parks, your community centres, places where people actually interact. And that's been replaced by people just scrolling on Facebook and seeing stuff on TikTok. And I think it's not going to be easy to try and change attitudes. But I do think if you look at a typical reform voter, they're probably likely to believe in nationalising key industries. They're probably likely to believe that there's a wealthy elite screwing us over. They're probably likely to believe that the cost of living crisis is a real issue. And I think it's about saying to people, we need to direct that anger at the right places, that we're all getting screwed over by energy companies ripping us off, by dodgy landlords, by exploitative bosses, and also pointing out the hypocrisy of people like Farage, who once claimed that he was the only politician in Britain keeping the legacy of Thatcherism alive. I mean, he was campaigning for a statue of Margaret Thatcher in Trafalgar Square. And now he's saying, we are the party that will reindustrialize Britain. We need to expose this hypocrisy. And I think it's about building links in those communities. One of the problems in the South Asian community is we're very comfortable in the big cities, in the towns where we're large in number. When the riots were happening, people in Luton and Birmingham were saying, oh, they won't do anything, there's so many of us. I said, what about being a black or Asian person in Liverpool or Hartlepool or Sunderland? Because that's a totally different experience. So I think we need to educate young South Asians as well about what it's like. I mean, if you think about Belfast at the moment, it is horrible to be a black and Asian person in Belfast at the moment. There's so much racist hate crime. And I was just meeting some friends the other day and telling them about this, and they were shocked. They had no idea that this was happening. And so it's about reporting what's going on as well. In terms of the divisions, I think on India and Pakistan at the moment, we're seeing it flare up. And it's so challenging because I think in the Muslim community, post 9/11, there was a resurgence in the sense of identifying yourself as Muslim, right? When you are attacked as Muslim, you defend yourself as Muslim. And I think that earlier kind of secular tradition of the 70s and 80s has been quite lost. But again, there's an increase in Hindu nationalism. In the Sikh community, you have the rise of Khalistan. And so we've kind of all retreated into these kinds of nationalisms as well. And I think trying to kind of talk about that proud tradition, that history of uniting different communities is really important as well. And I know that Tommy Robinson has actively tried to cultivate links with Hindus and Sikhs and tried to build this big campaign against Muslims, and that's been exposed recently. And so we need to kind of challenge that as well and make clear to people who aren't Muslim, for instance, that some of the first victims, for instance, of Islamophobic hate crime were Sikhs, because the racist doesn't care what religion you follow. They look at how you look. If you're wearing a turban, their stereotype of a Muslim is a man wearing a turban. And so Sikhs were attacked in parts of the northeast. A Hindu temple was targeted because racists believed it was a mosque. They didn't bother to check. They targeted, they graffitied it on it as well. And so I think communities need to understand that we're all going to be targeted by racists. They might say, oh, it's just the Muslims we don't like today, or it's just black people we don't like today. But really and truly, all of our communities will be impacted by racism. And it's about reminding people of that, I think.
Cool. Time for a couple more questions.
Great talk, it's very interesting, thank you. I found it interesting though, the first part of it was, the movement towards sort of home rule and independence, and then it sort of went to, post-war and what's happening here in Britain. So, from a British perspective, independence was, a momentous event. And so I'm just wondering, what's the South Asian perspective of it?
It depends who you ask, to be honest with you. I mean, partition was violent. There are a lot of people who were completely against the idea of two nations. In fact, in London, the Indian Workers Association, there was a split in the Indian Workers Association in 1944. Not over India and Pakistan, but over some petty factionalism, I imagine, like over an election. And one of the Muslims there, Chaudhry Akbar Ali Khan, he moved from Coventry to East London and set up a rival Indian Workers Association. And what's interesting, him as a Muslim and other Muslims in East London were campaigning against the idea of Pakistan. They had a protest meeting to say, we don't believe in this because this is going to create violence. We believe in one India. And I think there was definitely a tension emerging around the 1930s and 40s in the subcontinent, where when Jinnah was talking about the idea of Pakistan, you had the resurgence of the Hindu nationalism, the RSS and others emerging. And even now to this day, the legacy of independence, we think about Kashmir as well. I come from Azad Kashmir. It's interesting. We are probably Punjabi in terms of when I trace my ancestry, but our people claim Kashmir because we've resided there for hundreds of years, and there's ethnic Kashmiris there as well. And so I think the concept of borders and nationality and nations is very interesting. And when I talk to my cousins back, we come from a rural farming community where most people don't go past high school. They find it shocking that I'm friends with Indians. They can't believe it because that's what they're taught. They are taught that the Indians are the enemy, and in India it's the same thing. And so as much as people celebrate this idea of independence from British rule, the reality on the ground is awful, to be honest with you. It's very sad. Like, I think it's funny how some of these divisions break down in a diaspora. When I was in Malaysia, I was speaking to a Sikh on the train, a Sikh, Punjabi Sikh, and he was saying, like, we don't do any of that here. We're all just the Indian Malays here. We're all just one. And I think it was similar in the UK when they came. You would assume that after a big war between India and Pakistan, that they would be at each other's throats when they came to in the 60s and 70s. Actually, they were working very closely together because they were a minority and they recognized that they have to stick together. And so it's interesting trying to understand nationalism. And it's also quite funny because in Azad Kashmir, you've got these different villages. You go to one village and they say, oh, you know, people in that village, they're quite stingy. I wouldn't trust them. The other village say, oh, those people are, you don't. And it's funny, if you can understand that in the subcontinent, you can understand how prejudice might emerge in Britain as well. And so that's been quite interesting as well. I don't particularly have any kind of strong sense of nationalism as a British Pakistani. I don't know why. I think a lot of British Pakistanis do. I've never really felt that way. And I guess there's a lot of people talk about what could have been and what might have been. And you look at the treatment of Muslims in India today under Modi, and a lot of people say, thank God for Pakistan. So I think it's complicated, and I've not really kind of made my mind up on it all. It's just such a broad topic, isn't it? Yeah.
All right, well, final question? Yeah, you?
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I lecture in geography, so while you were thinking about history, which is super important, I often wonder if there's geography, and I'm so glad some of the conversation turned to quite a full time of, what we call national politics, right? And politics in the former colonies, so national politics here. One thing that's been missing, and I wonder if this is a conscious decision, either in your reporting or your academic work, is the role of caste, because you mention it. It's something that's maybe less understood in the working class anti-fascist literature, let's say, and something that's gaining more traction in global academia. But the idea of caste is it's linked with class, but it's obviously distinct. It explains a bunch of different reasons, whether it's migration, whether it's the migration that came from Uganda, you mentioned a kind of more elite, the diaspora from that was expelled by India. They actually came from a particular caste that has a historical tie with colony, right? And obviously that's the tactic of colony as well, colonizing as well, is to divide and conquer. There was a time when Muslims were, broadly speaking, favoured over Indians in India, right? Way back, obviously. And now, whether it's Tony Robinson or Zach Wilson or whoever, is painting of particular religious groups over others, right? Hindus, Sikhs, or Muslims. It's a tactic that has historical roots, but is, I don't know, I feel like very inspired when I hear about the 1980s. I was born in the 80s, but I grew up in the 90s, so I've seen this change. I grew up in a very diverse part of North London, so I've seen the difference, like growing up alongside people from India, I have Bangladeshi and Indian roots. And Pakistan, and now everyone being much more divided because of, you attributed it to growing caste difference, but I think it's more of a recognition or a strengthening of caste identity as well, alongside religious divisions, right? It's not like we mentioned. That I feel directly by Modi and Sons and Trump, and they're all best friends, Trump, Modi, close down. So, Mark Zuckerberg, you name it. So this, I just wondered, like, how do we confront this? Is it by educating ourselves, including Hindu diaspora, about the historical nature of the caste system, the labour roles are hereditary in the caste system, right? We can see that even in contemporary migrations. Educating ourselves about what it is, alongside other forms of racism, right?
So yeah, I think caste was a big thing in the Indian Workers Association. Many of them were Punjabi Jat. I come from that caste myself, and a lot of people in Azad Kashmir have that caste. And it was interesting that when I was talking about the divisions that emerged over petty reasons, it was things like that. It was interesting that the migration patterns, it was often a chain migration. So one of the uncles might say, well, I helped you get your passport, I did that form for you, so you're going to vote for me in the internal election. And as a Pakistani, I've seen that played out in Labour Party politics. And this has been a big scandal. People don't talk about it, but it sort of emerges. I mean, initially, a lot of Pakistanis and Indians wouldn't be represented in the Labour Party. So because they had the big family networks, what they would do is they would sign up all their family members to join the Labour Party to secure representation. And so it had a noble aim that, you know, we need to be represented. But what starts to happen is as the communities grow, you start to see the caste divisions emerging. So the Raja family says, oh, we want to control this part of the town, so we'll get all the Raja. I mean, I had friends in school who were like, I'm a Labour Party member, and I was like, you couldn't give a damn. He was like, I know, but someone signed me up, and they were voting for people, and they didn't give a damn. And we ended up in the British Pakistani community in places like Luton and Birmingham and Bradford with councillors who couldn't speak English, who were elected simply because they came from a particular village or family in Pakistan. And young people saw that system and said, I want nothing to do with this. You guys are all full of crap. I'm not interested in party politics. And so we had entire branches of Labour parties in Bradford and Birmingham and these places run on caste line. I think one of the problems of losing these radical traditions, these Asian youth movements with things like ideology, is that this is what fills the void, that some of these opportunists come. And the Asian youth movements took some of these people on. They would drag them out of mosques and community centres and say, you're not interested in the struggle, you're interested in the sound of your own voice. We deal with big egos in our communities as much as anyone else. And this has been a big problem. I remember in Luton, we had, like, my local ward was run by the Malik family, and they would exclude anyone who wasn't a Malik from meetings. I mean, that's clear caste discrimination. And there was a tendency to think that caste was just an issue that affects Indians, when actually it's been a huge thing. But there was also stuff in school, petty stuff, when people would say, oh, I'm from the Raja caste, and or someone might say, oh, I'm from the Chowdhury caste, and we're better than you guys, kind of thing. And then there's also the colorism, you know. I remember people say that I look Bengali, and it was interesting, like there was a guy speaking in my language saying, oh, look at this Bengali, and I was like, mate, I speak the same language as you. And there's petty things like that occur, anti-blackness, and it's when you lose those traditions and those organizations that educate people, that try and build coalitions between different communities, that have the politics, this is what fills the void. And it was interesting, there was a white councillor in Luton saying, this is really bad, but I can't speak on it because I'll get accused of racism. And I said, do you think our community benefits from this by having these people representing us? And he said, no. And I said, well, you all have a duty then to talk about these things. No community is perfect. No culture is devoid of any prejudice or any problems or any sexism or anything like that. And I think when I think back to people like Malcolm X, and people influenced by him, a lot of it was about reforming the community, challenging practices within the community. And I think that's just as important in terms of political organising of South Asians as is challenging racism outside the community as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Tom.